I'm going to say very little. I have basically 3 questions or 3 topics that I want to talk about. I want to hear from panelists about. And the first one I'm going to ask everyone about is, why are current systems of police accountability inadequate? What's wrong with them? The second question I want to ask is, why are law enforcement agencies across the country so good at resisting change? And the third question I want to ask is a solutions question. Like, what should we do about that? Both what substantive things should we change about police policy, but also what strategies and pathways can we use to try and overcome this powerful resistance to change in policing. So let's start with my first question about what is inadequate about current systems of police accountability. Maybe we'll start with Joanna, since she's sitting closest to me. Joanna recently wrote a book. It's fantastic. You should all go over there and buy it. But it's really wonderful. So your research describes how courts and legislatures and other policymakers over decades have been both expanding some legal rules and contracting other legal rules in order to create a system in which police departments and police officers are in large part immune from legal liability when officers engage in misconduct and harm communities. So some of those things a lot of us know about. Right? We've probably heard about things like qualified immunity in the news, but a lot of the things that you read about, I think many people have no idea how important they are to insulating police from liability. So tell us about that.
Sure, thank you again to Jennifer for having us, and I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. My research really is focused on one slice of this very broad question or set of questions and problems that you've described, and I've really focused my research and thinking on the piece of accountability in the courts in civil cases, meaning cases seeking money or seeking forward-looking reform, when police and other government officials have violated people's rights, have torn their lives apart and upside down. What remedy can they get in the courts to get some sort of justice, to try to get some compensation or some acknowledgement of what happened to them, and to try to prevent something similar from happening in the future? And a lot of conversation about those barriers, the challenges of getting to that some kind of justice in those cases has really focused on qualified immunity. People following George Floyd's murder were holding signs saying end qualified immunity. A lot of the focus is on qualified immunity. And qualified immunity is deserving, I think, of all the criticism that it gets. It's a legal protection that the Supreme Court created out of thin air in 1967 to protect officers even when they violated the Constitution, if they haven't violated what the court calls clearly established law. And they've defined clearly established law so narrowly that you have to find a prior court decision with virtually identical facts. And if you can't, even if what the officer did was clearly unconstitutional, the officer will get qualified immunity. But part of what I talk about in the book, and I've focused on my research, is that the attention to qualified immunity, while well deserved, is just the tip of the iceberg, and that there are legal protections for police at every stage of litigation. There is challenges finding lawyers who have the expertise and ability to bring these cases in many parts of the country. That is really tied to the way in which the Supreme Court has interpreted rules about when lawyers can get paid in these cases. There are restrictions on or requirements about what you need to know about your case before you can get it started, created by the Supreme Court in their pleading rules, which mean basically you have to have the facts that support your case before you even begin the lawsuit. And the lawsuit is where you're supposed to be able to get information from the other side. So the Supreme Court's rule creates a bit of a catch-22. Then there's the standard for holding officers for the standard for the Fourth Amendment and the Constitution, which is also very deferential to the police. You think of unreasonable searches and seizures, and with that language in the Fourth Amendment would make you think that if you have done nothing wrong and a police officer stopped you, searched you, assaulted you, arrested you, killed you, that your constitutional rights would have been violated. But the way the Supreme Court thinks about it, they focus on whether it was reasonable for the officer, under the rapidly evolving circumstances that they are faced with, to have done what they did. And what that ends up meaning is that people who have done nothing wrong can lose their liberty or their lives or their property and not have their constitutional rights violated. And it's only after you get past all of those barriers, disqualified immunity come into play. And there's more. There's challenges holding cities responsible. The burdens of proving cities liable for constitutional violations by their officers is an even bigger burden, even a bigger hurdle than qualified immunity is. And once you actually get relief in these cases, the ways in which settlements and judgments are budgeted for and paid mean that officers' bank accounts aren't affected, police departments' bank accounts aren't affected, and in many parts of the country, police departments don't even gather the most basic information about those cases, what happened in those cases, what information came out in those cases, the kind of information that you would need to make informed decisions about how to prevent something similar from happening in the future. So, to my mind, when you think about the civil justice system, the failures of the system created largely by the Supreme Court, although state and local governments have some role to play as well, is just challenge after challenge after challenge after challenge.
Thank you, Joanna. Tony, let's go to you next. You study these questions from a completely different angle. You study issues of policing and police accountability policy from the perspective of a sociologist. So talk to us about how social and cultural aspects of policing can weaken police accountability, can reinforce inequality, can reinforce racism in policing, those kinds of issues.
Yeah, so first, thank you to Jennifer, to the Wilson Center, to Ben, fellow panelists, everyone for being here today. So as Ben said, I'm a sociologist, and I've spent the past couple of years really interested in learning more about the politics and inequalities of policing on the ground. And so through interviews and observations and other sorts of methods, I've tried to learn more about the politics and inequalities of policing, especially in New York City. And so that's where I'm going to be focusing a lot of my comments overall today on. And so I think there are a lot of ways to answer the big question that Ben has posed. But one way to think about it is through a short story that I'm going to tell that I think shows two important points about how we need to think about policing. So after the murder of Eric Garner in New York City in July 2014, there were a number of reforms on the table. There were things like, so the city council was proposing things like mandatory reporting requirements on police uses of force. There were talk about independent monitors over the police department. There was a bill about how officers will need to identify and justify their stops. And so there were a number of reforms on the table, but the commissioner at the time, Bill Bratton, testified in front of city council and also appeared across media platforms and talked about how those reforms were quote-unquote overkill and that they represented and I quote, an unprecedented intrusion into the operational management of the police department. And so instead, the NYPD began rolling out their new neighborhood policing program, which is a community policing program, the most visible change of which was to introduce these neighborhood coordination officers who would run these build-the-block meetings where, in a setting similar to this, these neighborhood coordination officers are supposed to listen to people's complaints and submit them into organizational records. And so one red flag that came up in FOIA requests about this neighborhood policing program was that if you look at the form that NCOs are required to fill out when submitting those complaints, there's a category of crime type options. And if you look at the form, there's a drop-down menu of crime type options that NCOs can choose from when submitting complaints. And in that list, there are things like trespass, graffiti, gambling, prostitution, nothing on the list.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
please.
Okay, because this is my work, right?
Yeah.
We know what those acronyms stand for, but these folks don't know what FOI is, and they don't know. So let's go ahead and like help them understand what we're really talking about.
Yeah. So that's through a public records request. So basically, I submitted a public records request to the police department asking them for what the form looks like that their officers are supposed to fill out when they're submitting community complaints. So the idea is that, and thank you so much for it. So the idea is that after officers come to a meeting like this, they hear the different types of complaints that citizens are supposed to raise, and they're supposed to go back to their precinct and submit those complaints in the organizational records. And so in the template form that officers are supposed to fill out, there's a category on there that they're supposed to choose crime types from. So again, those crime types are basically things like trespass, graffiti, gambling, things like that. And so nowhere on that list of crime type options that they could choose from points to the NYPD itself, its officers, its policies, or its practices as possible sources of community problems. And so in other words, even if an officer wanted to submit a complaint about police, the form makes it impossible to do so. And so I think this short point reveals two different points about how we should think about police. So the first one is that police are not legitimacy maximizers, they are legitimacy optimizers. So in other words, we often hear about how important it is for police departments to get more public legitimacy. Legitimacy is important for police departments for a variety of reasons, such that, for example, people are more voluntarily willing to comply with police department demands. But however, police departments, or I argue that police departments may want public legitimacy, but not at the expense of independence over their organizational decisions. And so they try to balance these two imperatives, and that guides the types of programs and initiatives and reforms that they're willing to support or not. In support of community policing, less support for mandatory reporting. And the second quick point before I conclude is that police are not just law enforcers, but instead they're also political mobilizers. And so they are presenting themselves in front of media, strategically navigating the public sphere in ways that classic law enforcement instruments such as tools, arrests, and citations are insufficient to understanding how police operate in today's environment. And so
Great, thanks, Tom. So Don, I want to turn to you now and ask you to tell us about what you're seeing here on the ground in your organizing work in North Carolina and the Triangle area. What are a few examples of police accountability systems that don't seem to be working? And I know you're going to have a lot for us. So I know there's no lacking of that. But tell us about some of them, the ones that you think are most important.
So I think part of the problem with accountability is that we never start the discussion at its base. We never really start the discussion at its root. What I mean is this: law enforcement in America is the enforcement arm of white supremacy and capitalism. That is what we need to understand completely and totally about the role and the function of law enforcement. Law enforcement was designed to squash worker uprisings during the Industrial Revolution. They were designed to stop any type of worker protests. That is what they are designed to do. They are designed to maintain and protect the economic status quo of the privileged. Period. Now, this idea of crime and all this old bullshit, excuse my language, those are manufactured, right? Manufactured ideas around why we have these, right? And so because they are manufactured, we have all bought into the idea that that is the main function of law enforcement. So if all of our reform measures are focused on reforming parts of policing that are actually not the role of policing, they are never going to work. Does that make sense, Cheng? Okay. So the reason that there is no police accountability for law enforcement is because you can't have it. You can't have accountability and protect the upper classes, and protect white privilege, and protect white status quo, and control the movement of black and brown bodies, control the movement of poor, control the movement, and make sure that, because again, remember, don't take anything away from this, law enforcement is the enforcement arm of white supremacy. It is designed to maintain the social structures that enable the top 1% of our society to be the top 1%, right? So their job is to keep black people in their black communities, right? Hence, driving while black, walking while black, talking while black, right? Their job is to quell social uprisings that go against the status quo, which is why January 6th was such an incredibly successful uprising. Why? Because the system of law enforcement was not designed to police itself. So it made its brain strip gears, didn't know what to do. How do I respond when the people who are causing trouble are also the people I'm supposed to protect, are also the people that I am not designed to interact with in a way that is controlling, in a way that is minimizing, in a way that is compartmentalizing, right? So the biggest reason we cannot have accountability is because we are trying to create accountability around functions of law enforcement that are fabricated. And we are not creating accountability around the real and the driving and the primary function of law enforcement, which is to be the enforcement of our white souls.
Fantastic. A lot of ways, John, you have very much anticipated the next question I have for you now. So,
Maybe because
but I know that you've got lots more to say about this, so I'm not worried about it. The next question I wanted to ask you all is, as I mentioned already, is let's talk a little bit more about why it is so hard to fix this problem of police accountability. We've got law enforcement agencies have been remarkably good at resisting community demands and political demands, even in moments of enormous social pressure to change. And so I kind of want to talk about that next. I think we already have one very powerful, large-scale explanation for why that is true. But I want to hand this back to you, Don, and see if you have more to say on this topic, or to talk more concrete. I mean, one thing I'd love to hear from you is, what are the biggest obstacles in North Carolina, in the Triangle area? What are the biggest pressure points for a movement organizer who's trying to make change in a department like Raleigh or Durham?
the biggest obstacle, which will sound crazy, but it's very true. The biggest obstacle is unwashing, brainwashed minds. That is the biggest obstacle. The biggest obstacle is helping people disillusion themselves of the role that law enforcement actually plays, right? The biggest problem is helping people disassociate their sense of personal safety from law enforcement. Because statistically in research-wise, how people know, there is no real correlation between safety, personal safety, safety of your property, or any type of safety and law enforcement. Yet, your average person, their knee-jerk reaction is, well, if you take away the police, I won't be safe. Right? Also, they have this absurd, most people have this absurd, I mean, white supremacy has the best PR agent ever, right? They are incredibly good at what they do, you know, they're almost 500 years of building these falsehoods, these mythologies around these systems that are designed, that if the people gave up those mythologies, it would be much harder to control the masses, right? So, like, the hardest obstacle is getting people to get beyond the mythology, right? Because people's instinctual desire, sociologists help me out with this, because we want to believe that we live in an environment that is safe. That is a human intrinsic nature. So even Black folks and brown folks and people who have been harmed and marginalized by law enforcement, even those people still, their first reaction to law enforcement is they're the police, right? And that is reinforced in everything we see and everything we do. Hell, I do this for a living, and my favorite movie people are cops. You know what I mean? Like, my favorite movies are bad movies, right? With Will Smith and Martin Lawrence, and I love them. And it literally was not until about 2 years ago that my husband was like, do you not see the cognitive in this, right? And I'm like, oh shit. I am right, but that is how it happens, right? Is that, so the biggest obstacle to creating massive reform is convincing the people that they don't need police. So in the triangle right now, also in, you know, here in Durham, we're working hard in coalition with other folks in Raleigh. We just did an initial presentation in Fayetteville for alternative response units for mental health crises that do not involve police, at all. Durham has one that works really, really well. We're very much closer than we have ever been in Raleigh to getting one done. And we are now introducing the concept in Fayetteville. So we are hopeful that we can spread things like this across the state. And again, it's just one piece. But it is one of the most important pieces to correcting law enforcement, to making law enforcement, to abolishing law enforcement as it exists, and to creating something in its stead that is actually serving the function that everybody thinks law enforcement serves. The biggest obstacle to that is convincing people that they don't.
This connects really nicely to work that Tony has done in New York City, because so much of the work that Tony has done has been documenting all of the ways that the New York Police Department sort of ingeniously uses subtle methods of social and political networking to kind of convince members of the community that the police department is essential for the city's functioning. So I want to give Tony an opportunity to tell us a little bit about some of the ways that the New York Police Department uses these methods to maintain its legitimacy and reinforce itself during periods of crisis.
Yeah, so the book on the policing machine focuses on a set of tools and strategies and behaviors that the police departments implement in order to resist institutional changes. They do so specifically by controlling all the different channels of public input that might exist within a community. So if we think about the total pool of community complaints, demands, issues that might exist towards police, one way to think about them is that they can be voiced in either department channels or non-department channels. So department channels are those, think about the police community meetings which officers run, which have those forms that I was referring to earlier, that really allow police departments to strategically represent and record the types of complaints that they find are important and worth focusing on. At the same time, not all complaints are voiced in department channels. So non-department channels we could think of as independent channels, with those who are dissatisfied with department channels. They might be forming their own independent channels to voice their different demands, typically for police alternatives and or institutional transformations. Those independent channels, police departments can really just target coercive force in order to try to contain those demands for police alternatives as best as they can within those independent channels. So protests, police are heavily policing them and making sure that those demands for police alternatives are at best contained within those channels. I think it gets really interesting when we think about different partner channels as a type of channel where police try to influence different community organizations and try to cultivate constituents out of them. So for example, in New York City, the NYPD has built an alternative system of neighborhood representation. So in every single precinct in New York City, there is a community council. Community councils are run by a resident board of volunteer members who are elected onto those boards. The NYPD heavily influences those boards by passing a guideline that shapes every single aspect of community council operations. So who can vote in those elections, who can run, essentially every aspect of those community council elections. And they represent those community council members as the authentic neighborhood representatives, unlike traditionally elected officials and other folks. Another important partner channel that I discuss in the book are these clergy councils. So the NYPD has also established clergy councils and clergy liaisons in every single precinct in New York City. And those clergy councils are really valuable because they provide the police department with a stage to speak to faithful audience members, oftentimes brokered through their clergy member, the pastor, or what have you, who's organizing the religious institution. And this is important because the police department can speak to those faithful audience members and direct them towards their department channels. So you would see in New York City how there's a service called Watch Night Service, which is the most well-attended church service across the year. And so in that Watch Night Service, the NYPD precinct commanders would go in front of the church and tell people to, talk about different updates about the police department and what it has been doing, and then direct them to try to go to their department channels, those build the block meetings, where they exercise the control over the types of complaints that are reported and represented. And so by creating these different channels and targeting different resources, force, and leniency towards different channels, the NYPD can really control which types of community complaints get amplified and which ones get contained within those independent channels.
Cool. I'm sorry. Can I take like 2 minutes? Okay. Because I wanna talk really about accountability. Is that the police cannot hold themselves accountable. The police cannot police themselves. And the system is not even designed for them to police themselves, right? Here in North Carolina, your locally elected district attorney, it is their job to create accountability legally around law enforcement, right? We get mad at the police because they do something egregious, and then we go to the police department and we protest. That's the wrong place to be, right? The place where we need to be is at the district attorney's office, who has the power to hold them and the responsibility to hold them criminally responsible for their misdeeds. We also need to be at our city councils, right? Who in North Carolina, our city councils hire and fire our chiefs of police. They work directly for people that we elect, right? So when the next time you're pissed at law enforcement, go to city council. and tell them, because the chief of police works for them. Go to your locally elected district attorney and tell that person they need to hold law enforcement accountable because that is what we elected them to do. Statutorily in North Carolina, that is a part of their job, right? We cannot, nor should we, expect or rely on law enforcement to police themselves. No other professional agency or organization polices themselves in that manner. Internally, each department polices themselves. There isn't even an independent, there isn't even like a state bar, right? There isn't that. That doesn't exist for law enforcement, for the profession of law enforcement. So we have to make sure that we are putting pressure on the people whose job it is we elect to create accountability, who are not doing that. I am in Wayne County with Ward Freeman, who is notoriously uninterested in holding law enforcement accountable in any way imaginable, unless it's a black dude named Abuto. And you all here in Durham have a current district attorney who made a promise to create that level of accountability, to really scrutinize the actions and the charges and the things that come out of the police department, and has used her power to do that. I'm not gonna say her name, but if you turn around, you might be able to see her. And that is the difference, right? That is why we can't get accountability. It's not just because we can't look just at law enforcement, because law enforcement isn't gonna hold itself accountable. They aren't even designed to do that. But there are entities, politically elected positions, and people who can do that, whose job it is to do that, who are advocating that power on a daily basis. And those are the people that we need to be holding accountable, and we need to be taken to task for the stuff that we see from law enforcement. So that's your district attorney, that's your local elected city council, and that is also your legislators, because the laws that they passed in North Carolina that protect law enforcement is absolutely egregious. Absolutely egregious.
So we've gotten two really powerful explanations for some of the reasons why why law enforcement agencies are so good at resisting community demands for change. We've got an ideological explanation and a social political explanation. I wanted to give Joanna an opportunity to talk us through the latest.
Oh, no. Well, I actually think what I will say, I was going to say it anyway, it co-signs so much of what John has just talked about. Three main points. One, to the point that you just made, I understand that police unions are not a thing here in North Carolina, but I see the same move made all the time with police chiefs saying, "Oh, we'd love to fire the bad cops, but we can't because of these union rules." Well, and so the union is the bad guy in that story. But it takes two sides to negotiate and enter into a contract, right? And so it's the union who says, "Here's what I want," and then it's the city or the mayor or the city council, whoever it is, who says, "Here you go." And so, yes, I think that it's all yes and. We need pressure at all of these points to have any hope of making any sorts of changes. But directing all of that anger toward the police department ignores the fact that there are so many other institutions, local and state and federal, of course, but that are allowing these things to continue. The other thing that I would co-sign, is the point that Don made about needing to change points of view and needing to change the way people understand and the way really in which the fear of crime is being used to allow so much to go unchecked. And there has been a consistent story told since Reconstruction following the Civil War, when there was the Ku Klux Klan Act is what created the right to sue for constitutional violations. The statute, Section 1983, that is used in so many of these cases. From the time that act was being debated until today, and for sure tomorrow as well, the argument has been made that about the dangers of too much justice in these cases. That if people are able to sue police, courthouses will overflow with frivolous lawsuits, that officers will be bankrupted for split-second reasonable mistakes that they make on the job, that no one will then want to be a police officer, and chaos will ensue. That is, their version of that argument has been made for 150 years. And it's a very powerful argument, whether it's powerful on its own terms, or because it's just scary, or whether it's powerful because it's hiding a more nefarious argument. Whatever the reason, it's proven very powerful. And I have testified at state legislative hearing after state legislative hearing, telling state legislators who are thinking about getting rid of qualified immunity that officers will not be bankrupted, that they will not be paying a penny in these cases, that the Fourth Amendment already protects against reasonable mistakes. I show them a decade's worth of research documenting these things. And union officials on the other side say, if you get rid of qualified immunity, courthouses will overflow with frivolous cases and officers will be bankrupted, and they offer no evidence to support anything that they've said, and yet those bills die again and again and again. So I couldn't agree more with that point. The third point I really agree with is the point that you made about mental health, alternative responders. Because I see this sort of bleeds into maybe what the third sort of question about solutions, but I think that pushing for mental health responders as first responders is a really important step. And I think it's an important step, first because we need to get police out of the job of doing things that they don't know how to do. We can talk beyond that, whether we need police for anything, but we can, even police agree that they shouldn't be mental health responders. In Los Angeles, the LA Union has said we don't want to be in the business of being first responders to people with mental health crises. That's not what we're trained to do. We want to go get the bad guys. Fine. Fine, but we can agree, we may disagree about a lot of things, but we can agree that you should be in the business of mental health response. And there are programs across the country that have tried this. There's a program in Eugene, Oregon called Cahoots that's existed for decades, and it saves the city money, a lot of money, millions of dollars every year. It's one of those kinds of ideas, reforms, that everybody has something that they would benefit from for it. And I think finding those moments of convergence, of agreement, of shared agreement on one narrow point, and then doing all you can with it is a key step forward. And there's a last point that I think connects to this, which is, I think that people do get scared that if you take away police, then what do you have? If you abolish the police, what will we have? And I do think that there's a powerful counter message, because these mental health responders is adding something. It's replacing, it's finding a better way to do this thing that we have been entrusting police to do, to horrifying results. But it is an adding that will, in my view, result in a subtracting. But you add first, and then you subtract.
And also, the question, the best response to the question of what do we do without police is, what do we do without slavery? The United States was built economically on the back of chattel slavery. Abolishing chattel slavery was scary. These white folks had never had to work for themselves. They had never had to pay anybody. We didn't know what that was going to do to the economy, right? But at some point, what is morally right has to supersede what is easy. And we know we can do it, right? Because we're human, right? capitalism is not awesome, but it's a whole lot better than chattel slavery, right? And we did that. We did that. And if we could do that, we can do this.
Great. So we've got 10 minutes left, or a little bit less than 10 minutes left, which means that we can have a short conversation about the last question and the solution to another. There's so much more that we could say. So I'm just going to open up to all three of you and ask you, what have you found in your work to be the most fruitful or impactful pathways to more accountable, more equitable, more effective, smaller policing? And what can caring policymakers and also community residents do to help?
Unrelenting, speaking truth to power, right? And unrelenting, one of the things that one of our Emancipate agencies, one of our funders, calls us narrative first responders. And she said it, and I was like, that's freaking brilliant. That's exactly what we do, right? Because here's the thing: changing hearts and minds, right? Taking the mythology out of law enforcement and laying bare what it actually is about telling a story. One thing that Emancipate does incredibly well is get in front of a story and flip it. Because we all have the tendency to believe that the police are the good guys, and they're telling the truth. Even though time and time again, tape come out, the report come out, and we don't know what's going on. But even still, we are shocked at the lie. But we never impute them with the characteristic of being liars, right? They are always given the benefit of being truthful. And what Emancipate does is it gets right out in front of those stories and changes a narrative from, literally, this is literally a real life story. Knife-wielding man shot by the police department changes to family man suffering a concussion from a car accident, shot and killed in front of his family. That narrative shift is so incredibly powerful, and it's so important to demystify law enforcement and the role that they're supposed to play. So, yeah, we find that getting out and taking their story and making it the people's story, and giving, because the people recognize the truth in the story that we tell, right? They just don't see them down there. Nobody is speaking their truth. And so we speak their truth. And if more of us would speak their truth, they would have the courage to say, yeah, that's bullshit what you're talking about right there. That's not right? And they would say it strongly, and they would be able to fight back, and they would be able to question. Now I can tell you, there are lots of people who never questioned the police before, who, and while we were all over North Carolina, will say, if something happens, well, I'm gonna wait to see what Emancipate says. That's power. That's giving power back to the people, and it's taking power away from these systems that are designed to oppress. So.
I mean, I would say, I think that of the things that I've seen, I think local is better, always. Community-based work is always more effective. I think that finding ways like mental health responders to create things that where everyone can feel like they've won, if there's a way, can be really powerful. And I also agree with the notion that the change is not coming from the inside. That it has to be from the outside.
And sewing them alive. Sewing them alive and very, very live. Like not quiet sewing. We're gonna sue you and then hold a big ass press conference. Then send a letter and then contact our national journalists and get a story running in the Rolling Stone about how crappy the police are in this city because of what they did here. Suing asses. They hate that.
And I do think, mean, that is the, you know, to me, that's what I focus on, that's what I research, that's what I think about, and sometimes people say, well, why are you focused on the legal system? Why are you focused on suing them? Why don't you change culture? Why don't you? And I think I would love to be able to change culture, but it does take all of it. But I do think I hold that same faith. Maybe it's too optimistic or doe-eyed or something, but the lawsuits get people's attention, and
Especially if you talk about it a lot.
plaintiffs' lawyers and their clients are the most motivated people in the whole system with the most powerful tools through discovery to force officers to sit in depositions, to force information from their files. It's a really powerful tool.
Yeah, and it's not always about the legal pieces, right? Again, one of the lawsuits that we filed, we were able during deposition to get a copy of the record to say, yeah, we have policies, but nobody follows. You know, that, like, no matter what happened with the lawsuit, just that one little nugget, holy crap, yeah, we got policies, but nobody follows them. In a deposition on a freaking record, for real?
No, just a quick point that I agree with these changes, and I think they highlight the monopoly that police departments and police have over not just force but information. And so the lawsuits and the narratives are all part of thinking about different ways to demonopolize police power over information.
Well, I think we can turn it over to Q&A at this point. Is that right? If anyone has any questions from the audience for this amazing panel, that would be fantastic.
Yes, I have a question. When you talk about suing, what about the average person, you know, who may have been subjected to violence, you know, to the system, and every which way they turn, they don't know, you know, where to go. You know, people don't want to take on, you know, maybe the suit or the legal ramifications for suing people. What would you tell them?
So here's what I would say to you. First, if you're in North Carolina, call Emancipate. We're not going to charge you. Okay. But it's only 3 of us. So we can't do everything, right? The second thing I would say is that we have to change the way that we think of litigation as a tool, right? Like it is not going to hold these folks accountable, right? And we don't have to sue them to create accountability, right? We don't have to. It is the most structured way and the most sure way and the way that you will get to see something tangible and real as a result of your efforts to create accountability, but it is by far not the only way, right? Because again, there's lots of litigation, but if nobody knows that people are getting sued, if nobody is talking about it, if nobody is willing to share their stories publicly or to talk about the grimy stuff that happens during litigation publicly, it's not helpful. That's the part of litigation that's helpful. Litigation is a tool to expose truths, to change hearts and minds, right? Now, holding individual folks accountable, it requires, and again, I'm going to tell you about Emancipate. I can't tell you how many times I've fought with law enforcement agencies about letting people see body cam footage and them telling folks they can't see it. The hell if they can. And I'm helping to see it. And I'm helping fight it. And we gonna tell the world your story, right? Now, does that get you money? Does that make you whole? Not necessarily. But what it does do is restore your dignity, right? It gives you back control if you don't hear it. And it also lets them know that when they see you, they see us. So they're gonna think twice about fooling with you. And if we can do that, as many people in the world, in North Carolina, that Emancipate can do that for, we will. It's about making sure that we are keeping each other safe. I can't tell you how many times I give out my personal cell phone number all the time to children, to whoever, teenagers, college students, whoever, community. Look, I am your bully. So when the police pull you over, you call. And when they tell you you need to hang up that phone, who's on that phone, you say, my lawyer's on the phone. You know what that does to the power dynamic in the room? Those are the things that we have to do for one another. That is how we keep each other safe. And that is how we create accountability. My number is 919-607-3217. 919-607-3217.
Yeah, this is making me think about whether or not resistance to alternative response is in part because if the lack of necessity for law enforcement in those areas is exposed, it will become clear that there may in fact be other areas where it's not necessary as well.
Yes.
Okay, I figured that I would get one yes on that.
Yeah, I agree also. I think it's interesting. So in LA, Los Angeles, for this example, the Los Angeles Police Department says they want alternative mental health responders because, as I said, they want to be fighting the bad guys. Clearly, it seems clear that the Los Angeles Police Union does not want any reduction in their budget, without a doubt. However, and you're much more savvy about political engagement than I am, but I do think that it's possible, at least, that the first step is you show that it works. And you show that it could save money it could reduce arrests, it could, however you measure it. And then you have a new reality 3 years later, where there is this mental health responder unit. And then you can say, okay, well, let's look at what our budget is, and let's look at what the police budget is. To my mind, trying to do both of those things at once is going to it's not going to work, because the police union in LA, or police power, whatever it is going to be powerful enough to say, we don't want a reduction in our budget. But if you keep the police budget where it is, and then you create mental health responders, and then however much time goes by, you say, well, now let's take a look at what the responders are doing. Let's take a look at what this budget is. And that's when the conversation can happen.
I think it's also about, again, it's about money, right? Like, they don't want to give up the money. And they don't want to show that they're not wearing any clothes, right? So every time you create a system that mimics what law enforcement claims they're doing without the need for a gun and life and death situations, you show that the emperor is wearing no clothes. And that's not good for them, right? That's not good for law enforcement. It's not good for the industry of law enforcement. Like, for example, why the hell do you need cops to show up when you have a car accident? The hell do they know about car accident or insurance? Why are they there? Right? Why do you need police officers to give people speeding tickets? Why? Why do you need a gun to give someone a speeding ticket? Why? To tell somebody that their tags are expired. Why? And the problem with alternative responses is that it creates air for those kinds of questions to be asked in real ways. And then has the potential of creating quantitative data that shows that we don't actually, that the emperor really isn't wearing any clothes. That's problematic.
I guess I will say that I think a lot of what I'm referring or thinking of as the policing machine is about police departments trying to demonstrate that there is demand for police services. So those police community meetings, oftentimes, for example, officers would take a picture of the room, show how crowded or seemingly crowded the room might be. Those community complaints are represented as some sort of endorsement for police services, as demand for additional presence or additional police help. And so I think the policing machine is geared towards documenting and displaying that demand. And then there are different ways that communities and cities can do to resist it.
I don't think this question is appropriate for this panel. I hear all this and think about it. The judicial system is right for question. Talk about district attorneys with law schools, looking at attorneys that are not only elected, but by common sense. One of the issues I don't live on is better term for that. Our law schools are able to put out district attorneys that will really make impacts and make changes to this. Or sort of bigger about the system that change it.
I missed part of the question, yeah.
I understand you're saying that law schools are creating these district attorneys and these officials. Is there a way to change legal education, to change sort of the output of what you end up getting in terms of legal leadership, or is this problem bigger than the law schools? I guess I would say, now that I've said the question, I'm going to try to answer it. But I think that the problem is bigger. I mean, I think that the problem is bigger. I think that law schools can do a better job than they do. But I do think that the problem is bigger. In the same way that racism and policing is not about policing, it's about racism. I think that, the problem with district attorneys or with the sort of legal infrastructure is not limited to law schools.
But I don't think that they can help. Right? I think that part of law school education, again, this is another mythology, right, that we have to bust, is that law school teaches you how to be a lawyer. It doesn't. Law school teaches you how to think like a lawyer. You learn how to be a lawyer on the job, right? Like, no law school is taking you into courtrooms, no law school is telling you where you can sit, no law school is showing you where the lawyer's bench is as opposed to the bailiff's chair, nobody's telling you what a damn shuck is. None of that is happening in law school. Law school teaches you to think like a lawyer. It doesn't teach you to be a lawyer. And that's probably one of the biggest damn problems about law school is that lawyers learn on the job, right? Like, we don't have, even with doctors, they have like residency. We don't have residency. Like, you learn it on the job. And law school doesn't teach you how to be a lawyer. It teaches you how to think like a lawyer. So I think part of that has to have, and I think part of injecting thinking like a lawyer is that we have to ask law schools to be intentional and deliberate about creating pathways for students to learn to think about the law, not as this omnipotent being that can correct all things, but as a tool, right? As a tool in a bigger struggle. And that the law, because you leave law school believing that if you have the right fact pattern, you should be able to predict what happens. And nothing could be further from the truth, right? So, yeah, I think the best way to create better days is to diversify what it means to think like a woman. And that can happen in law school.
I was just curious. We saw, after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and several others in the summer of 2020, this really intense attention on policing and what that meant. And then, just a few short months later, there was quite a lot of backlash. And I think now we've arrived at maybe what is even worse, which is somewhat just not attention, right? From the media, from systems. And so I'm wondering what your recommendations are for how to operate in those systems when you start to have not only fewer calls for accountability, but also just the entirely backlash as well, both from the media and the sort of systems.
Well, I think that it is. I think you're absolutely right. I think that the legislation that was successful, the state legislation, happened right after George Floyd's murder. There was a moment horrific tragedy to occur. I think it just has to be, I don't think that there's a simple answer. I think it's agitating at the local level. I think, journalists are doing tremendously important work in this space. The New York Times just had a series about sheriffs in Mississippi. And it was a series of stories that were really horrifying. And it was over a year, and at the end of the year, Mississippi legislature passed or introduced, a police accountability bill. And who knows whether it will pass, but it's moving forward. And I do think that when there is pressure and attention put on specific departments, specific practices, I think that you can get traction. I think it's important to be really specific about the target. And I think press attention is hugely important. Whether the information comes out through investigative journalism or through litigation or through community advocacy, to me that's the way in which when things are happening, it's prompted by that kind of specific attention.
And also, I want us to not be so quick to claim defeat in this moment, because let us be clear, the term or the concept of abolishing the police has been around for decades. Defunding the police has been around for decades. But it is only in the last 5 years that it has made its way into mainstream American lexicon, into the American psyche, that it has become a viable alternative to the police state. That is some incredibly powerful stuff, right? And the backlash that we are seeing is not because we're losing, it's because we're winning, right? And don't ever forget that the backlash is because we're winning. They gotta go so hard because we are converting, because different conversations are happening at dinner tables, because different motivations are leading in the ballot boxes. They're not gonna talk about it. They only want you to see the fact that they swing it back real hard. But do not ever forget that if we didn't push the pendulum as far as we did, there would be nowhere to swing from. We are winning.
Yeah, so I guess the one thing I'll say, that I don't know if it gets to the point, but I think it's one of the concrete ways that I think cities could help on this issue that hasn't been raised so far, is that, so in New York City, the police department controls the sound permits for public events. And so whenever a protest or even a visual for a victim of police violence comes up, organizations mobilizing for police accountability and police alternatives face a real ideological and practical dilemma of whether to apply for a sound permit, pay the $45 fee to the precinct, and reinforce the police department, or incur the risk of getting shut down and then lacking recourse for holding a permitless event. And so one concrete policy change that can be that should get attention, I think, is that we need to rethink the regulatory power that police departments have over public events. Because there's a conflict of interest that arises whenever a protest or something like that arises. And so I think that kind of helps sustain the different types of movements that happen even after, a long time after particular incidents of controversial violence.
That is such an important point. And also it's important for us to know what that line is and not be scared to get right up to that line. Right? Like when Emancipate is involved and our partners are involved in public protests, part of it is training, right? Part of it is education. And we will tell people, look, If you can't get arrested today, now in North Carolina, the law just changed that if you're involved in a protest and the police believe you meet a certain criteria, you have to spend 24 hours in jail. You cannot be bonded out until after 24 hours. If you will lose your children because you cannot pick them up from school, if you will lose your job because you can't be in jail for 24 hours, now is the time to go home. There is no shame, right? Because that is about keeping each other safe. But if you can, right, Becky, if you can, Karen, if you can, I need you to put your white body on the line and do that work, right? That is how we keep each other safe. I don't even think that had anything to do with anything I was
Well, thank you so much, I think we're out of time.